This is the third part of our Chapter 6 on long-term memory PowerPoint presentation. In this section, we're going to cover the remember, know procedure, and we will also talk about the difference between explicit and implicit memory. So, researchers wanted to look at the effect of time on memory, and one way to study this is with the remember, know procedure. So we do know that memories for recent time tend to be more accurate and we have more information about them. And so the remember know procedure asks whether a stimulus is familiar and if the circumstance under which it happened is remembered. So it could be that a stimulus is familiar to you, but you cannot recall the exact event when it occurred. And so there are three different types of responses here. There is the stimulus is familiar and I remember exactly what happened and when it happened. I know that the stimulus is familiar, but I don't remember experiencing it before. Or I don't remember the stimulus at all. What this demonstrates typically is that the longer a memory is in your past, the more it becomes semanticized. So you'll see that word at the bottom there, and that means that you've lost the specific details of the memory of the episode, but you remember the general meaning or knowledge about that. So you know maybe that your fourth grade teacher's face is familiar, but you can't remember specific instances in which you interacted with your fourth grade teacher. One of the remember, know experiments was tested, used older subjects, and what they were asking these older subjects was whether they could remember public events from 10 years or less, and then they also presented them public events that happened 40 to 50 years ago. So what you will see here is that both remember and know are high if it was 10 years or less. But what you see a drop in, if it's 40 to 50 years before, is the remember category, meaning that they might know and be able to recall the general information about an event, but they don't specifically remember the episode, so the episodic memory is lost. And then, of course, you also have an increase in the don't know category if it's 40 to 50 years ago, because it just might have been forgotten. There are two different types of long-term memory as well. Explicit, meaning that it is conscious memory, and implicit, not conscious. And we know this by doing a variety of tasks. So we know that implicit memory exists because we have procedural memory for things like riding a bike, learning to drive a car, and we also are able to look at neuropsychology again to see patients with brain damage and how they are able to remember certain aspects. So we will go through a few examples of that. In your explicit memory, you have the episodic and semantic memory that we've been speaking about. And then in the implicit category, you have procedural memory, priming, and conditioning. So repetition priming is when you might have seen something before, but you're not necessarily attending to it. So there's one task that your textbook refers to about presenting words, but the focus is not on the word itself, it's on the color perhaps. And so you are not necessarily rehearsing or thinking that you need to remember those words, but then you are primed if you see that word again later. Procedural memory, as I just said, is more about your memory for activities in your life, so that's the reason that you don't need to pay as much attention when you are driving home if you are taking the same route every day. And then we also know that classical conditioning is an example of implicit memory. This is just a repetition really that it is unconscious memory that is overseeing the procedural skills memory and priming. and then explicit would include the episodic and semantic memory. Again, the skill memory is memory for actions. You don't necessarily know when you learned to ride a bike or where you were, but you do know that you can do them. And one of the things that helps us understand this is when there is a patient with brain damage, such as HM, who is able to learn new tasks. So he could not form new long-term memories, so the encoding process was impaired, but even still, he got better at learning mirror drawing. So I do have an illustration here so you can see what the mirror drawing is like. HM would not remember that he had done the mirror drawing task before, but with each time that he performed the task, he improved. So that's how we have evidence of implicit memory in that task. You can see here if you were doing this task, you would have to look at the mirror and follow along in the mirror to actually draw the star, and it becomes much more difficult, but it is something that you can improve at with time and practice. Again, repetition timing is when you present a stimulus and it affects performance in a future presentation of the same stimulus. So this work by Graf and co-workers in 1985 used 3 different groups. One particular type of brain damage is Korsakoff's syndrome, and so it is when the amount of alcohol a patient has had over their lifetime leads to significant brain damage and amnesia. And then you have patients with amnesia without amnesia who are being treated for alcoholism, so that was a control level there. And then finally you had patients with amnesia who had no history of alcoholism. And they tested both explicit memory and implicit memory. And what they found, they presented words to them, and the patients who had amnesia were not able to encode those into their long-term memory. So you can see that green column there, when they were asked to recall the words, they performed very poorly on that task, while the other 2 control groups did fairly well. The other test that they gave was completing 3-letter word stems. So if the word was table, they presented TAB, and the patients would have to complete the final letters of that word. Now, when they did that task, they were not able to rely on their long-term memory in a conscious way, but what we found is that they were able to use implicit memory to fill in the blanks, and you can see the performance greatly improved for the groups there, for the green amnesic group. So this tells us a little bit about how implicit memory works, and these are some examples of how we know that implicit memory is really a phenomenon that occurs. And that ends our first chapter on long-term memory.